The night was not silent. It carried with it a strange vibration, the kind that lives underneath sound rather than inside it. On the last day of October, the town was draped in decorations, paper skeletons swaying in the breeze, lanterns glowing faintly from porches, and children moving from house to house in costumes that were meant to be playful, but looked disturbing in the shadows. The streets smelled of wet leaves, wax from candles, and faint smoke drifting from bonfires. It was Halloween, the night people pretended to flirt with death, never truly believing that death might take the invitation seriously. The story begins with a scream that no one could quite place. It rolled across the darkened neighborhood like thunder, but never broke into an echo. Some said it came from the old house at the edge of the cemetery. Others insisted it came from the woods. A few swore they heard it inside their own homes, as if the voice had been standing right behind them whispering before it turned into a shriek. What all of them agreed on was simple. It was not a child's scream, not playful, not a trick meant for the holiday. It was raw, guttural, as if something was being torn away from the human soul. Hours later, when the night should have been settling into routine, candies sorted, masks thrown aside, parents counting the footsteps of their children, something remained unsettled. The pumpkins on porches seemed to flicker in unison, their carved faces twitching like something alive. The breeze stopped as though the night itself was listening. Every sound became louder, too sharp. The rustle of leaves felt like footsteps, the creak of wood like someone drawing closer. It was a night drenched in ritual, but this time the ritual did not belong to the people of the town. The unsettling part of this story is not that something terrible happened. Terrible things happen every day, and people learn to turn away from them. The unsettling part is how many people witnessed something and yet no one agreed on what they saw. At the center of every recollection stood the same moment. The scream, the abrupt silence after, and the feeling that something had stepped into the world that should have remained outside. There are those who believe that Halloween is the thinnest point between the living and the dead. This night carried the weight of proof. The first witness was a boy, no older than 12, dressed as a pirate. He said he saw a figure standing across the street, under the dead oak tree that never grew leaves anymore. The figure wore no costume, held no lantern, and did not move even when the wind shifted. The boy described the face as hollow, the body as thinner than a shadow. When he blinked, the figure was gone, but the sound of footsteps followed him all the way back to his home. He told his parents, but they laughed, saying Halloween had always made imagination stretch further than they should. Yet when they locked their doors later, both admitted they felt watched through the windows. Another account came from a woman carrying a bowl of candy for late visitors. She said she saw a hand pressed against her glass window from the inside, fingers long and pale, leaving behind no mark when it withdrew. She lived alone. Her house was locked. She checked every room and no one was there. The handprint existed only in her mind, but she swore she felt the glass vibrate as if someone was standing inches from her. Then there was the driver, returning from the outskirts of town, headlights cutting through mist that seemed too thick for autumn. He swore that his lights revealed dozens of carved pumpkins in the middle of the road, all lined up neatly, their faces unfamiliar. When he blinked, they were gone, but his tires made a sound as though they were crushing something soft and wet beneath them. He never checked what it was. He never wanted to know. Stories like these began to stitch together into something larger, darker. What tied them together was not what was seen, but what was felt. A heaviness in the air, a silence that did not belong to night, and a presence that pressed against every locked door. It was not fear of masks or of costumed strangers or of childish pranks. It was the sense that something old and nameless had walked into their homes, into their streets, into their breath, something that belonged to the earth before towns existed, before traditions like Halloween turned fear into games. The mystery only deepened when morning came. No one vanished that night. No bodies were discovered. Nothing had been stolen or destroyed. Yet the town was not the same. Children woke with nightmares they could not explain. Dogs barked at corners of empty rooms. Candles refused to stay lit, blowing out as though invisible lips leaned across them. A shadow had passed through, leaving behind no crime to solve, no evidence to study. Only the certainty that a boundary had been broken. And so the story lingers, because the question remains unanswered. What had entered that night, and why did it choose Halloween? Was it drawn to the masks, the laughter, the mockery of death? Or was the town simply chosen at random, caught in the path of something it could not understand. When people gathered in whispers in the following days, they did not ask who screamed or what figure had stood under the oak. They asked a question far more chilling. If something had entered, had it ever left? The town had always carried a reputation it did not ask for. Tucked between long stretches of farmland and an ancient forest that pressed its roots into the soil like veins, it was small enough to escape maps and too quiet to invite visitors. Outsiders described it as picturesque, but those who lived there knew it differently. They knew that the silence of the streets was not peace but waiting. They knew that the forest was not merely old but ancient in a way that resisted time itself. Halloween had grown into more than tradition for this community. It was ritual. Each year the houses lit their porches with carved pumpkins, their faces glowing with fire, not for joy but for protection. The elders told stories passed down for generations, that the lanterns were not decorations but guardians, flames that kept away what waited in the trees when nights grew long. Most laughed at these stories during the day, but no one dared leave their home dark on October's last night. Superstition had long since rooted itself in habit, and habit was hard to ignore. The cemetery at the edge of town told its own story. Its stones leaned crooked, names and dates eroded until they were little more than smudges on rock. Some markers stood so close together they seemed like families buried all at once. There were graves so shallowly dug that rainwater filled them like black mirrors in the earth. No one could say how old the cemetery truly was because no record explained the first burials. It was simply there before the town was built, as if the dead had arrived before the living. Children dared one another to run through it at night, but adults avoided it without needing reason. The town's oldest houses, sagging under their own roofs, whispered of lives that had ended too early. There were stories of fires that swept through whole streets without spreading to neighboring homes. Accounts of sickness that emptied families in weeks, leaving their houses standing like hollow shells, doors forever shut. People spoke of missing children who were never found, only remembered by fading photographs tucked in drawers. All of it carried a weight, a subtle reminder that the town was not like others, that the soil itself was layered with memory that resisted forgetting. Halloween brought all of this to the surface. By day it was a performance with costumes and candies, laughter echoing down streets dressed with cobwebs and scarecrows. But by night the festival shifted. People locked their doors earlier. Porch lights grew dim, as if bulbs refused to shine too brightly. The carved pumpkins burned longer than anyone admitted. Candles left to melt down to stubs inside their grinning shells. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. Halloween night belonged to something else. The celebration was not for the people. It was for what might be watching them. This particular year, the atmosphere seemed heavier. The days leading up to Halloween carried a stillness that pressed against windows and sat on the chest like a weight. Birds abandoned their nests early, leaving trees silent. Dogs barked into empty alleys and refused to walk certain paths. Children woke crying in the night, their dreams filled with things they could not describe. Even the forest seemed to lean closer, its branches arching over roads that once stood open. People whispered that it felt different, that something in the rhythm of the air had shifted. There was a story from the town's beginnings that resurfaced every Halloween, one that people half believed, half feared. The tale spoke of a harvest gone wrong, centuries earlier, when crops rotted in the fields and famine stalked families through the winter. Desperate, the townspeople turned to the forest, where they left offerings at the base of the oldest oak tree. No one recorded what they offered, only that it was not crops, not animals. Afterward, the famine ended. The story never said whether the town was saved because of the offerings or despite them. What it did say, in hushed tones passed from one generation to the next, was that the town had owed something since then. And every Halloween, the debt was remembered. That story was dismissed as folklore, but in the privacy of their homes, families still whispered it over candlelight. They spoke of how the pumpkins were not symbols of joy but replacements, faces carved to confuse the watching things, candles lit to mimic human souls, tricking what might come searching. For many, Halloween felt less like celebration and more like bargaining. The laughter, the candy, the costumes, those were the disguise. Underneath, everyone carried the same quiet question: what if the stories were true? The children loved the holiday because they did not yet understand the weight of it. They ran in masks, shouted through the streets and accepted candies from doorsteps. Yet even they felt it. Their games always slowed near the cemetery. Their footsteps faltered near the forest. Some instinct they could not name guided them away from the darkest corners, even as they laughed and pretended to be monsters. The older they grew, the more they stopped pretending. The more they realized that Halloween was the night when pretending could become real. The people of the town rarely spoke about the unease directly. They buried it beneath jokes and decorations, beneath playful talk of witches and spirits. But their actions betrayed them. Every year on October's last night, doors were locked earlier, curtains were drawn tighter, and candles burned longer. Some families refused to sleep at all, choosing to sit together in silence until dawn broke and the threat felt lifted. It was not fear of mischief or crime that kept them awake. It was something older, something that could not be named. This was the weight carried into that year's Halloween. It was not just tradition, not just superstition. It was the repetition of something ancient, felt in the marrow of every person who walked those streets. They sensed it before the scream shattered the night. They sensed it before the shadows seemed to move on their own. They sensed it in every candle they lit, every mask they tied, every door they closed. The town lived inside a cycle, one it never escaped, one it barely acknowledged. Halloween was not just a holiday. It was a reminder that something in the dark had once been bargained with, and something in the dark might come to collect. The scream marked the beginning, but it was what followed that carried the weight of dread. The night stretched on, but nothing returned to normal. Houses that should have felt safe seemed altered, as though the walls themselves were listening. People told themselves that what they had heard was nothing more than a prank, a cruel trick of teenagers, or a wandering animal caught in pain. Yet deep down they knew better. The sound had not been playful, and it had not belonged to anything human. In the hours after the scream, the town's rhythm faltered. Trick-or-treaters vanished from the streets far earlier than usual, their bags half full, their laughter cut short. Parents herded their children home, pulling them indoors as though the night air itself had grown poisonous. Curtains that had been left open to show off decorations were drawn tight. Porch lights, once glowing, were switched off, leaving pumpkins to burn alone in the dark. The festive noise of Halloween drained away until the silence of the streets felt unnatural, as though something had hushed the town into submission. It was then that the first strange accounts began to surface. A group of children huddled together in costumes swore that they saw someone walking between houses who was not part of the festivities. The figure wore no mask, carried no lantern, and did not move like a neighbor. The children described its gait as too smooth, too quiet, as if its feet did not touch the ground at all. They followed it with their eyes until it reached the end of the street and turned the corner. But when they ran to see, the street was empty. Others spoke of voices carried on the wind. At first they sounded like distant laughter, faint and broken. But when people stopped to listen, the laughter shifted into something closer to crying. The sound came from nowhere and everywhere at once, bouncing from rooftops, twisting between trees, always close but never visible. A man who had been handing out candy on his porch later told neighbors that the voices seemed to whisper his name, though no one else admitted to hearing it. He left his bowl of candy outside and locked his door, refusing to open it again until daylight. The most disturbing detail came from a teenager walking home from a party. She claimed that every house she passed had its pumpkins facing her. The carved faces seemed to twist as though watching, their candlelight flickering in sync, creating the illusion that the grins were moving. She tried to dismiss it as imagination, but when she glanced back after turning onto another street, she swore the pumpkins had changed places, new ones appearing where none had been before. Her parents dismissed the story, but she refused to leave the house for weeks afterward. The accounts piled up in fragments. Some people saw figures where there should have been none. Others heard doors creak open in empty houses or footsteps pacing above their ceilings, even though no one else lived there. A dog that had been tied outside a porch was found the next morning untied, its leash perfectly coiled, the animal shaking and refusing to leave the safety of the kitchen corner. Contradictions deepened the unease. One family said their clock stopped at the exact moment of the scream, refusing to move until morning. Another family claimed their clocks raced forward, skipping hours as if time itself had bent. A woman who had gone to bed early swore she woke in the middle of the night to find her room covered in a faint orange glow, as though dozens of pumpkins surrounded her bed. When she blinked, the glow was gone, but the smell of smoke and melted wax lingered in the air. People gathered in whispers the next day, trying to fit their experiences into something logical. Yet no one could deny that the night had carried a presence. It was not simply fear. Fear was ordinary. This was something heavier, something that pressed into their bones. It made every explanation sound hollow. It was not the sound of the scream alone, but the way the night twisted after, bending into shapes that did not belong. Children asked questions their parents could not answer. Why had the streetlights flickered in unison? Why had the air felt like it was breathing? Why did the jack-o'-lanterns all look like the same face no matter who carved them? Parents silenced the questions with stern voices, but their own eyes betrayed unease. They too had felt the shift. They too had seen shadows that did not align with the world around them. The longer the night stretched, the more unbearable the quiet became. It was not simply silence, it was expectation, as if the town was holding its breath, waiting for something else to follow. And the worst part was the uncertainty. People did not know if what they witnessed was outside their homes or inside their minds. They did not know if the figure at the end of the street was real or imagined, if the whispers in the air belonged to ghosts or to their own thoughts turned against them. That uncertainty grew into paranoia. Neighbors stopped trusting one another, peering through curtains at shadows moving on the sidewalks. Families sat in their living rooms with all the lights on, staring at their doors, convinced that someone was about to knock. Some believed the scream had been a warning. Others thought it was a signal. All agreed that the night had changed them, and through it all the pumpkins burned. They stared with their carved grins, candlelight trembling, eyes too sharp in the darkness. No one admitted it, but everyone felt the same dread, that the pumpkins were not protecting them this time. That something had passed through the thin veil of Halloween, something that would not leave simply because the morning sun rose. When morning finally came, the town did not sigh in relief. Instead, it stared at the evidence left behind, evidence that was both too little and far too much. The daylight revealed details that deepened the unease rather than dispelled it. Every street seemed to carry its own peculiar scar from the night, as though Halloween had left behind something more than wax and wrappers. The first clue came from the cemetery. Groundskeepers arrived early, expecting nothing more than the usual litter of candy wrappers, broken bottles, and trampled flowers. What they found instead froze them in place. Dozens of graves had been disturbed, but not in the way one might expect. The soil was untouched, no signs of digging or vandalism. Instead, the stones themselves had shifted. Headstones that had stood in crooked rows for generations were turned, all facing the same direction, toward the oldest oak at the edge of the lot. Even the smallest markers, those for children, had been rotated with uncanny precision, as if unseen hands had worked in silence through the night. In the woods near the cemetery, hunters reported strange carvings etched into the bark of trees. They were not initials, not names, not symbols anyone could easily recognize. They were circles intersected with jagged lines, resembling faces but distorted, as though drawn by someone who had forgotten what human features looked like. The strangest detail was not the markings themselves, but the height at which they appeared. Some were carved into the highest points of trunks, far above the reach of ladders or climbing tools. It was as though something taller than the trees themselves had pressed its symbols into the wood. Closer to the houses, objects were found that no one could explain. A rusted lantern with no candle was discovered on a doorstep, its glass cracked, the metal slick with moisture despite the dry night. A doll with missing eyes was left on a porch that belonged to a family with no children. On one street, every door handle was found to have faint scorch marks, as if someone had pressed heated iron against them. Yet no fire had been reported. These details seemed meaningless in isolation, but when spoken aloud, they joined into a pattern too deliberate to dismiss. Testimonies from the townspeople were equally strange. A boy insisted he saw a procession moving silently down the main road, dozens of figures carrying unlit lanterns, their faces hidden beneath hoods. He said they did not look at him, but every head turned in unison when he gasped. The boy's mother swore he had been inside the house all night. Another man claimed he saw his dead father walking across the field, head bowed, hands clasped behind his back, moving with the same shuffle he remembered from childhood. He called out, but the figure did not stop, vanishing into the mist. His neighbors dismissed it as grief rising to the surface. Yet he insisted that the scent of his father's pipe tobacco, lingered in the air for hours afterward. Reports collected by the local sheriff only added to the confusion. He found footprints in places where no one admitted to walking. They were too long. The heel stretched unnaturally far from the toes, and yet the prints were sharp as though pressed deliberately into the soil. In one backyard, they circled endlessly, overlapping again and again, forming a spiral so perfect it seemed carved with tools. In another yard, a single print was burned into the grass, blackened as though scorched from below. The sheriff tried to keep the details quiet, but rumors spread faster than silence. By midday, the town was alive with whispered theories. Some believed vandals had orchestrated it all, a cruel trick to frighten the community. Others thought it was evidence of something darker, something that confirmed the old stories whispered about Halloween being a night when boundaries grew thin. The divide between those explanations left the town in a state of fracture. Neither theory was safe. One required them to believe that their neighbors had turned cruel, the other that something beyond their understanding had entered their streets. Psychologists later argued that mass hysteria had taken hold. Fear spreads quickly, they explained, and once people expect to see something, they find it. The scream, the figures, the carvings, the objects, each could be the product of suggestion and heightened emotion. Yet their theories stumbled when confronted with the physical evidence. The scorched handles, the shifted gravestones, the impossible carvings high on trees. Fear could explain memory, but fear could not twist stone, could not scorch iron, could not blacken grass in perfect circles. There was one final piece of evidence that no one wanted to discuss openly. Several families reported that their mirrors cracked overnight. The glass did not shatter outward, but splintered inward, as though something on the other side had pressed its weight against it. A woman who discovered hers broken swore she saw a face lingering in the reflection just before the final crack appeared. A face with features too sharp, eyes too hollow, and a grin too wide. She fainted in her hallway and refused to step into that room again. Each clue only deepened the puzzle. The evidence resisted a single explanation, slipping between rational and irrational, between human cruelty and inhuman intrusion. Together they formed a story without shape, one that could not be held or resolved. The town became trapped between believing it was haunted and believing it was cursed, neither choice offering comfort. The strangest part of all was not the clues themselves, but the way they vanished. By the second night after Halloween, the scorch marks faded, the carvings lightened, the footprints blurred. The doll on the porch was gone, the lantern rusted into dust, the cracked mirrors swept away. It was as though the town was being erased piece by piece, leaving nothing but memory. But memory was enough. Memory held weight. Memory haunted in ways the physical never could. And so the clues remained, not in the world around them, but in the minds of those who had seen. Minds that replayed the scream, the symbols, the figures. Minds that knew the boundary between safety and horror had already been crossed. Evidence did not prove anything, but it was enough to convince the town of one truth they could not deny. Something had been here. Something had left its mark. Fear does not always shout. Sometimes it settles quietly, slipping into the corners of the mind where no light can reach. That was what happened in the town after Halloween. The physical marks of the night faded, scorch marks softened, symbols washed away by rain, objects vanished as mysteriously as they appeared, but the weight in the air remained. It pressed into homes, into families, into the fragile balance of daily life. Fear had entered through the cracks of Halloween, and now it lived inside them. The children felt it first. They stopped playing outside as freely as before, their games cut short by shadows that stretched too far across the ground. They whispered among themselves about faces at the window, about laughter heard in dreams, about pumpkins that moved when no one was watching. Parents dismissed these confessions as nightmares, but the exhaustion on their children's faces betrayed something deeper. Bedtime became a battle, each child clinging to light, refusing to let the dark swallow their rooms. Even those who managed to sleep woke screaming, unable to describe what had crawled into their dreams. Parents carried the weight differently. They did not speak of it openly, but silence grew between them. Conversations trailed off into uneasy pauses. The adults tried to bury the strangeness beneath routine, but it never worked. When a neighbor crossed the street too quickly, suspicion sharpened. When a dog barked at nothing, glances were exchanged with narrowed eyes. Trust once assumed in a small town began to rot. People locked their doors earlier, triple-checking bolts. They left lights on all night, though they never admitted why. Some stopped leaving their homes after sunset altogether. The most telling change was in the gatherings. Before, Halloween had been followed by warmth, families sharing leftover candies, neighbors speaking across fences, laughter echoing even when the decorations were being taken down. This time there was no laughter. Porches grew quiet. Invitations were not offered. People looked away from one another, too wary to admit what they had felt. The silence stretched until it became a kind of agreement. No one would speak of that night because to speak of it meant to acknowledge it, and acknowledgement made it real. But silence did not mean peace. It meant that the fear festered unseen. A mother began to refuse mirrors in her home, covering them with cloth after claiming she saw her reflection move before she did. A man who once walked to work each morning now drove, unwilling to pass the oak tree near the cemetery, muttering that it leaned closer with every day. Children refused to walk alone in hallways at school, saying the lights flickered when no teacher was watching. These were small acts easily dismissed, but together they painted a picture of a community unraveling beneath its own skin. The fear seeped deeper into the body. Sleep became restless for nearly everyone. Dreams took on strange shapes, repeating symbols and faces that no one had seen yet everyone seemed to recognize. A circle, a jagged grin, a shadow without eyes. Some woke with scratches on their arms, thin lines that burned though no memory explained them. Others reported waking in strange positions, sitting upright in bed, staring at the corner of their rooms without realizing they were awake. The more they tried to ignore it, the more it returned. Families fractured under the pressure. Arguments broke out without reason, tempers flared, and trust between spouses eroded. Some accused each other of fueling hysteria, others of hiding truths. A father swore his daughter was lying about hearing footsteps in her room, until the night he heard them himself and refused to admit it. A woman accused her husband of sneaking outside during the night, but he insisted he had been asleep. She later woke to find footprints leading from their doorway into the yard, prints too large to belong to him. These cracks widened, leaving people isolated in their own homes, fearful of those closest to them. The community itself began to carry a shadow. Churches reported dwindling attendance, their pews half empty even on Sundays. Markets closed earlier, lights shut off before dusk. Rumors spread that something had cursed the town, that Halloween had opened a door which had never closed. Others insisted it was not a curse but a debt, that the offerings once made at the oak had been forgotten and now the price was returning. People disagreed on the explanation, but none denied the result. The town no longer felt like home. It felt like a place under watch. Even the air seemed different. Neighbors spoke of a heaviness, a pressure that weighed on their lungs as though breathing too deeply might call something closer. Birds avoided rooftops, leaving empty skies. Dogs howled at odd hours, their cries long and mournful, unbroken until dawn. The forest grew louder, branches creaking in windless nights, leaves rustling with no movement. Some swore they heard voices carried through the trees, not screaming, not laughing, but chanting low and steady, like prayer or warning. Paranoia turned inward. The people of the town began to question themselves. Was the scream truly heard or imagined? Were the symbols real, or carved by fearful hands desperate to prove something? Was the figure under the oak ever seen, or was it born from centuries of stories buried in their blood? Doubt twisted them, but doubt never saved them. Even those who told themselves it was all hysteria still found themselves locking doors, still found themselves staring at their own reflections longer than before, waiting to see if the glass would ripple. In time, the fear became part of life. It shaped choices, altered routines, marked how children played and how adults moved. It was not spoken, but it was always there, an invisible weight pressing down on every hour. The town became haunted not by what had entered that night, but by the knowledge that it might never leave. Fear was no longer an intruder. It had become the closest neighbor, one that walked silently beside each person, one that slipped into every home, one that watched through every pumpkin's grin. And when the next October began to approach, the fear deepened into something else, expectation. The people felt it in the rhythm of the days, in the shortening of light, in the smell of burning leaves. They knew that what had passed through their town once could pass again. The question was not if. The question was when. The town could not endure silence forever. Fear had wrapped itself so tightly around their lives that people demanded answers, no matter how fragile or incomplete those answers might be. Rumors alone were no longer enough. They wanted someone to explain what had seeped into their streets on Halloween night. It was then that investigations began, though the word itself would prove hollow. The sheriff was the first to act. He had already collected testimonies, written into reports that felt more like fragments of nightmares than official records. When he attempted to compile them, the contradictions made the papers unreadable. Some witnesses swore they saw figures walking in silence. Others claimed the same streets had been empty. Some heard laughter, others heard weeping, while a few admitted they heard nothing at all. Still, he organized patrols, sent deputies into the woods, and measured the burned footprints left in yards. Yet by the second day, even he seemed shaken. Deputies whispered that the sheriff sat for hours staring at the spiral-shaped tracks in one backyard, tracing them with his finger on the page as though they contained a code. He did not speak of it afterward. Investigators from nearby counties eventually arrived. They approached with skepticism, convinced that hysteria had consumed the town and that practical explanations would unravel the mystery. They photographed the scorched door handles, mapped the rotated gravestones, and inspected the strange markings carved into trees. Their reports suggested vandals, pranksters, and simple decay. Gravestones, they said, often shifted with time. Fire could be the careless act of drifters. Carvings could be nothing more than teenagers with knives and too much imagination. Yet their words rang empty, even to themselves. When one investigator pressed his hand against a burned patch of grass, he pulled it back immediately, claiming it was still warm days later. His colleagues laughed, but the sound carried unease. Psychologists attempted their own form of explanation. They described what had taken place as mass suggestion, a kind of collective hallucination born from fear, tradition, and expectation. They argued that Halloween was already a night steeped in symbolism, and that people had been primed for unease. The scream, they claimed, acted as a trigger, setting imaginations spiraling into shared illusion. People saw what they expected to see, heard what they feared to hear. Fear spreads like disease, they explained, and once released, it infects every witness. Yet this theory collapsed when confronted with evidence too solid to dismiss. The broken mirrors, the lanterns, the footprints pressed too deep into the earth. Hallucinations did not crack glass or scorch metal. Folklorists were drawn to the town soon after. They dug into archives, listening to the stories that locals had tried to bury for generations. They spoke of the harvest famine centuries ago, of offerings left beneath the oldest oak, of debts that might not have been paid. They pointed to the symbols carved into trees and compared them to ancient protective marks, crude drawings meant to ward off something that once hunted in the dark. If protection had been attempted, they argued, then perhaps protection had failed. The town had kept its traditions alive with pumpkins and lanterns, but perhaps those rituals were only echoes of something more severe, something forgotten. If the debt was real, then Halloween had simply been the time it came to collect. Some theories turned darker, less folkloric and more conspiratorial. There were whispers that the government had once used the forest for experiments, that signals or chemicals had poisoned the land, causing hallucinations. Others believed that the scream itself had been artificial, played through hidden devices to test human response to fear. These voices grew louder when investigators left without conclusion, their reports locked away, their visits unacknowledged afterward. Files vanished, photographs were misplaced, and officials refused to speak of the town again. Silence from authority only deepened suspicion. Yet the most disturbing theories came from within the community itself. Some believed the figures seen on Halloween night were not strangers, but reflections of the dead buried in their own cemetery. Relatives returned not in peace but in mimicry, walking through the streets like shadows of memory. Others insisted that the scream had not been a warning but a call, that the town itself had answered, and that each person who heard it was marked. These whispers spread fear more effectively than any official report could, because they did not dismiss the experience, they embraced it. Religious leaders attempted to reframe the events in their own terms. Some declared it demonic, evidence of sin seeping into a community that had grown careless in faith. They called for prayer, for confession, for fasting. Yet even inside the churches, the air carried unease. People swore the candles flickered during sermons, shadows stretching too long across the walls. A priest claimed he found the pages of his Bible rearranged, verses missing. Others repeated in strange order. He told no one at first, fearing madness, but when he confessed to fellow clergy, They too admitted that their texts had appeared altered. Faith trembled, and with it the only comfort many had left. Paranormal investigators arrived eventually, drawn by rumor. They set up cameras in homes, recorders in the cemetery, and sensors in the woods. They asked questions into the dark, demanding response. At first, nothing answered, but on one recording, faint laughter bled through the static, followed by a low voice that no one could identify as male or female. It whispered words no one could translate, yet every listener agreed they sounded too close, as if whispered directly into the ear. The team left the town quickly after that, refusing interviews, abandoning equipment. Their silence spoke louder than any footage. The theories never agreed. Rational explanations clashed with folklore. Conspiracies fought against faith, psychology tangled with evidence. Yet the result was always the same. Nothing was resolved. No theory explained every detail. No investigation brought peace. Each attempt only left behind more questions, more cracks in the fragile structure of certainty. And through all of this, the town remained divided. Some clung to the idea that it had all been hysteria, desperate to believe that human minds could be fooled but not invaded. Others whispered of debts and rituals, of something waiting beneath the oak that had grown impatient. Theories gave shape to fear, but none of them closed the door. The town was left with possibility, and in possibility there was no safety. The only conclusion shared among them was simple, and it was the most terrifying of all. The story was not finished. Whatever had entered their lives on Halloween had not left. The theories explained pieces of the puzzle, but the picture remained incomplete, and in that incompleteness lay the true horror. It meant that the next Halloween was not a celebration to prepare for. It was an arrival to dread. The years that followed did not erase the memory. If anything, time made the silence heavier. Each October, as the air cooled and the nights lengthened, the town felt the same shadow returning. People lived their lives, built their routines, raised their children, but beneath it all the memory of that Halloween lingered. It became less of an event and more of a presence, a quiet truth stitched into the fabric of the place. Some tried to deny it, others tried to bury it, but denial did not soften the weight. It waited. Children who had been small on the night of the scream grew older, but they carried the memory of their parents' unease. They inherited the fear even if they had not understood it at the time. To them, Halloween was not a holiday of joy or candy. It was a reminder of the night when the ordinary world shifted and never quite returned to place. They lit their pumpkins with shaking hands, tied their costumes with glances over their shoulders, and went home earlier than their own children would one day understand. Fear became an heirloom, passed from one generation to the next. The cemetery still stood, and the oak still leaned over it, larger and darker each year. Some said its roots reached deeper into the earth than any tree should, drinking from places no one wanted to imagine. The gravestones never shifted again, but people refused to walk there at night. They claimed the air around the oak grew colder, that the soil stayed damp no matter the weather. That whispers circled its branches like wind, but carried no breeze. Offerings began to appear there again. Candles, flowers, coins, sometimes food left to rot. No one admitted leaving them, but the base of the oak was never empty. The houses carried their own signs. Cracks in the walls that returned no matter how often they were sealed. Windows that refused to stay clear, fogging even on warm days as though someone was breathing against them. Mirrors that warped light, bending reflections into shapes that lingered a second too long. The town lived with these details the way one lives with scars, unwanted but undeniable. Stories spread beyond the town, whispered by travelers who heard fragments of what had happened. Some treated it as legend, a tale meant to frighten, stripped of its truth by distance. Yet those who lived inside the town never called it legend. They did not embellish or dramatize. They did not need to. The truth was already heavy enough. Every Halloween afterward became less about celebration and more about endurance. Families locked their doors earlier. They carved their pumpkins not as decoration but as protection. Flames flickering through grins meant to confuse what might be watching. Some stayed awake until dawn, refusing to risk dreams. Others gathered together in silence, waiting for the night to pass. The sound of laughter and costumes returned to the streets, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of tension, a knowledge that joy was only disguise, and still, no one could answer the question that had lingered since the first scream. What had entered the town that night? Theories multiplied but never satisfied. It was hysteria. It was ritual. It was conspiracy. It was something old that had woken. Each answer unraveled beneath its own weight. Each answer left behind a larger silence, and silence was the most haunting truth of all. The greatest fear was not that something had come once. The greatest fear was that it had never left. People spoke less openly about it as years passed, but they felt it in their bones. They sensed it in the way the forest seemed to lean closer each autumn. They sensed it in the way shadows in their homes grew longer than they should. They sensed it in the feeling that someone was always standing just outside the door, waiting, watching, patient. Some tried to escape. Families moved away, abandoning homes they had lived in for generations, yet even they confessed that the memory followed them. They dreamed of the scream in unfamiliar bedrooms, woke to the sound of whispers in houses far from the oak. The fear was not confined to the town. Once felt, it clung to the soul. Leaving did not erase it. For those who remained, Halloween became a ritual of waiting. Waiting to see if another scream would tear through the night. Waiting to see if the figures would return to the streets. Waiting to see if the pumpkins lit with trembling hands would be enough to protect them again. Each year, when the candles flickered and the shadows deepened, the town held its breath. Some years passed quietly. Others carried strange events. Unexplained knocks at doors, faces glimpsed in windows. Clocks that stopped for hours before springing back to life. Nothing ever as terrible as that first night, but nothing ever normal either. And so the story endures, not as a tale of what happened once, but as a reminder of what waits still. It is not a story of the past, but of the present, repeated every year when October dies and November begins. The truth is simple and cruel. Some debts are never paid, some doors never close, and some nights never end. Halloween is not celebration. It is recognition. Recognition that something stands just beyond the light, patient and eternal, waiting for the flame to dim. Perhaps the most chilling thought is not what came that night, but why it chose them. Was it chance? Was it history? Was it a debt carved into the soil before the town even existed? No one can answer. The only certainty is the question itself, a question that grows heavier each year as the pumpkins burn and the shadows wait. If it entered once, when will it return?